Edward? Perfect, lovely, great. Hello, everyone. So we continue the sugya of Amgushi. In the last shiur, I think it was a lighter shiur than usual, in which we explored a lot of ideas and around magic, and it was quite good fun. This shiur, I'm afraid, I have nothing to promise you, but what was Winston Churchill's words? But tears, toil, and sweat. This is going to be a tough shiur in which we try and make sense of the Gemara. Again, I mean, it's so fascinating how you learn a sugya, and until you start thinking, it appears so basic, and then one tries to work out what's going on, and it's not clear-cut at all. So what I'd like us to do is really just try and read the Gemara, and then we're going to read together the sources I printed on of the Beis Yosef and the Bach and the Shach and the Gon on trying to understand the sugya. I hope everyone here has managed to see the sources, but we're going to have to learn through them. Amgushta, so let's have a look at the Gemara. Amgushta, Rav Shmuel, Chadam Ichashi, Chadam Gedoifi. One of them, we don't know which one, that's the what's going on in the Gemara. One said these are Chorshi, they are magicians or sorcerers, and one said they are heretics, Gedoifi, they are Megadef, they are heretics. Then the Gemara wants to prove this is Rav. To Stein to Rav, let's prove that this is Rav. To Omar Gedoifi, who says they are heretics. To Omar Rav Zutra Batuvia Omar Rav, because we have another tradition in the name of Rav. Halome Dova Echad Min Magus. Anyone who learns anything from these Amgushta, from the Magus, from the Magus, Chayav Misa is Chayav Misa. Now, why would you be Chayav Misa for learning from the Magus? Isal Kedata Charshi, if you think they are magicians, you shouldn't learn from magicians to do. But you are allowed to learn from magicians to understand or to teach. Tistayim, says the Gemara, we have proven our point that indeed this is Rav. So let's just try and understand the Gemara. So we have here three pieces of information. Piece of information number one is Rav's view that if you learn from Amgushi, you are Chayiv Misa. The second piece of information you have is Rav's view that if you learn magic in order to teach, you're allowed to learn magic in order to teach. That's the second of Rav's views. The third piece of information is that there's a machlokas, Rav and Shmuel, and we don't know which is which, as to what Amgushta are. Are they heretics or are they magicians? So a number of questions spring to mind. The first question, by the way, those who want to see each other rather than be highlighted can click on view and see gallery view. I like seeing everyone, so for some reason I just got put on gallery on Spotlight, which I was hesitating a bit, just threw me a bit. So we have here a machlokas, Rav and Shmuel, as to whether what Amgushta are. Are they Charshi or Gedufi? Are they heretics or magicians? So a number of questions spring to mind. The first is, why is there this machlokas about what Amgushta are? Why can't we just determine what they are? Why can't we just go and speak to them and find out what they are? This is one of the questions that trouble the Mefarshim. The second question that we could speculate about is, where is Shmuel in all of this? We conclude, seemingly at the end of the Gemara, that Shmuel, Rav is the one who said that Amgushta are heretics, because if he held they were magicians, he wouldn't have said that if you learn from Amgushta, you're Chayiv Misa, because there's nothing wrong with learning from magicians. You can't learn from heretics, but you can learn from magicians. So therefore we conclude that it is Rav who says that these were heretics. What's Shmuel's view? Well, Shmuel then would say they're magicians. Great, because that's the flip side of the argument. But what would Shmuel say about the other two statements? Would he say that you're not allowed to learn from them? And if you learn from them, you're Chayiv Misa? And would he say you are allowed to learn from magicians? He can't say both, but in theory, he could say one or the other. Again, Rav made two statements. Rav said you are not allowed to learn from Amgushta. Would Shmuel agree with that statement or not? Shmuel holds Amgushta are magicians. but he could still say that you're not allowed to learn from them. So we don't know what Shmuel would say when in his belief that Amgushi are magicians, whether you're allowed to learn from them or not. The second thing that Rav says is that someone who learns from a magician, that you are allowed to learn from a magician. Would Shmuel agree with that? He can't maintain three things together. He can't maintain that Amgushi are magicians, and that if you learn from Amgushi you're chayiv misa, and that you're allowed to learn from magicians. Those three views are incompatible, which is how the Gemara learns out that it was Rav who was the one who said that Amgushi are heretics. But more than that, we don't know. We don't know what Shmuel would hold about learning from Amgushi, and we don't know what he would hold about magicians. Does anyone have any thoughts about this issue? Do we have any evidence around Shmuel around these two views? Okay, so this is a question over here, what Shmuel would hold. The final point I want to mention, which I wasn't even aware was a question until I read Rashi, is what's the translation of tistayim? How would you translate the phrase tistayim? So I assumed that sorry, Jeffrey, yeah.
We discussed this. I had this in the back of my mind that it was in some ways we tried to make it a double proof, that two proofs rather than a single proof. But I'm not sure whether that's right.
Can you explain what you mean?
The tistayim is that there should be, is that the Gemara tries to bring, sometimes when the Gemara says tistayim, it tries to bring two proofs that what it's saying is correct. Tistayim in like a double, like enayim or asnayim, rather than a single. And we're trying to work out if that was right, if there was two reasons why it was what the Gemara was saying.
Okay, so that's the normal translation to tistayim is not, it just means it is concluded.
Right, okay.
It doesn't have a sense of a multiplicity about it. So tistayim just seems to mean it's concluded. So what?
We discussed a bit. I mean, I thought that there was two views. Is it tistayim that is Rav's view, or is it tistayim that's the Gemara's view? And I was leaning on this is the tistayim of that is the opinion in the Gemara. That's the conclusion in the Gemara, because it doesn't say tistayim the Rav. It just says tistayim the Gedufi.
Okay, so the Gemara's discussion. What question is the Gemara dealing with? When the Gemara says tistayim, it is concluded. My presumption was, and we'll see that Adam is not wrong, but I don't understand why he's not wrong. My assumption was that the tistayim, it is concluded, is going on the conclusion of the debate or the discussion or the question that the Gemara is addressing. And we need to zoom in. The question of the Gemara is not what is Amgushi. That's not the debate of the Gemara. The debate of the Gemara is not whether you're allowed to learn from Amgushi. The debate of the Gemara is not whether you're allowed to learn magic as a theoretical discipline. The only debate in the Gemara is, who said this, Rav or Shmuel? Chad Oma and Chad Oma. And it's trying to prove who said it, Rav or Shmuel. That was my reading in the Gemara, because that's what the Gemara is coming to prove, because it brings another statement of Rav. Bringing another statement of Rav is no evidence of Halacha. It just brings another statement of Rav. All this is saying is that if we match the two statements of Rav together, and Rav maintains that Amgushi means that you're not allowed to learn from Amgushi, and you are allowed to learn from magicians, it must mean Amgushi are heretics. So the tistayim simply means we can determine which ones, who said this. It must be Rav who said that they are heretics, and therefore by process of exclusion, it must be Shmuel who said that they are magicians. However, Rashi doesn't say that. And I don't know the answer to Rashi, other than Rashi picking up on a textual nuance, which Adam picked up on, which is the Gemara doesn't say tistayim to Rav. It doesn't say let's prove this, tistayim we conclude it's Rav. It just says it is concluded. So have a look at Rashi, tistayim. Tistayim to Gedufi, let's conclude that they are heretics. Hilchach kol tevarav tivya avodah zarah. Everything that this heretic is saying is words of avodah zarah. And therefore separate yourself from them so that you don't learn, that they don't persuade you after their false beliefs. Probably, by the way, the correct version of Rashi is kol devar of divrei minus. Everything that they say is heresy, and probably it was censored out of Rashi to avodah zarah in order to avoid offending the censors. So either way, Rashi says that the conclusion of the Gemara is that these are that these Amgushta are indeed heretics, and therefore stay away from them. Now, I don't see why Rashi sees that in the Testayim. All the Gemara says is Testayim, which seems to mean Testayim that we can determine that this is Rav, rather than Testayim that we can determine what the Pesach Halacha is. So this I pose as a question in Rashi, along with our other two questions, which is why is the Gemara confused about what Amgushta are? Just find out what they hold. And secondly, what's Shmuel's stance on all of this? Is Shmuel merely disagreeing about what Amgushta are, but agreeing that you can learn from magicians, and therefore would agree that, and agreeing that you can't learn from heretics? It just happens to be that he thinks Amgushta are not magicians. So let's have a look at how the various Mefarshim deal with this. And effectively, we have several viewpoints. We have Rabbeinu Yerucham, who is quoted in the Beis Yosef, in the Rabbi Yosef Cairo. And then we have the Beis Yosef who disagrees with Rabbeinu Yerucham, and then we have a Bach who defends him, and then a Shach who disagrees with it. That's the sort of lay of the lands of the conversation that took place across the generations. Rabbeinu Yerucham is a Rishon, precedes the author of the Shulchan Aruch. So we have a Rishon on the Sukkah, Rabbeinu Yerucham, and then the debate of the poskim, the Beis Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Cairo, and the Bach, Rabbi Yoel Sarkis, and the Shach, who are the commentaries around the Torah and around the Shulchan Aruch, who take issue with the Beis Yosef and Rabbeinu Yerucham. So let's have a look in the Beis Yosef inside. Galsinon, so this is at the bottom of page 2. Galsinon in the source sheet. Galsinon beperik kal gadol. Halomid min Amgushi, afilu divrei Torah, chayv misa. Someone who learns from the mages, even Torah, is chayv misa. The Amgushi who mechashev o min ha'adok b'avodah zarah is either a magician or a heretic. He draws people near to his faith, his evil faith. King Kosov Rabbeinu Yerucham. So Rabbeinu Yerucham believes, it seems to believe, that it is not halachically resolved as to what the nature of Amgushi is, and it remains indeterminate whether they are heretics or magicians. Now, in practical halacha, given that most of us don't meet Amgushi, we would assume that this Gemara, this debate about what Amgushi are, is of no relevance. All we need to know is, if we follow Rav, for example, is that if you meet an individual, and this individual is a magician, you can learn from him. And if this individual is a heretic, you can't learn from him. But it doesn't really matter what Amgushi are, because that's history. We don't meet, unless you live in regions of Persia, where they still, I believe it's still a religion that exists a little bit undercover. I believe there are some practitioners of it. I think it's mainly in the diaspora. I think in that region of the world, they're not able to practice because of persecution, Muslim persecution. But I believe there are still some significant numbers who practice this faith. So if you meet an Amgushi, then this applies. But for the rest of us who don't meet such figures, the halachic conclusion is heretic. No, magician, yes. Rabbeinu Yerucham says that it remains unresolved which ones they are. Now, the Beis Yosef then brings our Gemara, and I'm not going to read this. This is the next sort of 6 lines of the Gemara. Velishon Gemara Hach Isa, and he quotes the Gemara, and then he quotes Rashi. Then he, in the concluding lines of the Beis Yosef at the bottom of page 2, he says, Rabbeinu Yerucham Nura, it would appear from Rabbeinu Yerucham, the Masakere, he was Masupak, in Malacha Karav O Shmuel. Whether the halacha is like Rav or Shmuel, or Leficha Kosav, and therefore he wrote, Bein min Achashi, bein min Gedufi Asa. Whether Chashi or Gedufi is Asa. So says the Beis Yosef. Does anyone have any problems with this summary of the view of Rabbeinu Yerucham?
Well, if he does say Asa at the end as opposed to Chayav Mita.
Yeah, okay, that's a fair point. Why would he say Asa as opposed to Chayav Mita?
Well, because he can't hold both, because we're saying that they hold different views, so he can't hold that it's higher for both of them.
Okay, so this is the confusion over here. He says Asa rather than Chayav. I think I'm going to agree, Max, with your core point, which is a very, very important point, but disagree with your answer to Adam's diuk. The reason the Beis Yosef, that Rabbeinu Yerucham or the Beis Yosef says osa, is because when we say chayv misa, we don't mean in court. There's no court is going to put someone to death for speaking to a heretic. It's not a chiyuv misa. When the Gemara says chayv misa, means it's very profoundly osa, perhaps a heavenly misa, spiritual death. If you speak to heretics, you risk being seduced by their perspective. Don't do so. There's no explicit chiyuv misa for speaking to an Ovid Avodah Zarah. If you do Avodah Zarah, you're chayiv misa. Indeed, if you do magic, you're chayiv misa. If you speak to a heretic, you're not chayiv misa. You're simply playing with fire, and the Gemara is saying in very strong language, don't do this. So in halachic terms, the correct thing to say is osa. However, Max, you're onto a very, very profound point, which the Beis Yosef summarizes the view of Rabbeinu Yerucham as saying, since we don't know whether we paskin like Rav Shmuel, therefore don't speak to a magician or to a heretic. Is that a reasonable summary of the Gemara? As Max said, not in the least. The Gemara argued, Rav and Shmuel, what is Amgushi? Are they a heretic or a magician? Rav is the one who said, don't speak to Amgushi. By the end of the sugya, we know why. It's because he holds they are heretics, not magicians. If they are magicians, Rav says explicitly, you can speak to magicians. So how can Rabbeinu Yerucham summarize the Gemara as leaving unresolved and therefore out of doubt, don't speak to magicians or heretics? The very figure who said don't speak to Amgushi is Rav, and Rav holds you can speak to magicians. The only reason you can't speak to Amgushi by the end of the sugya, is because we now understand that Rav held they were heretics. So this is a very confusing Rabbeinu Yerucham, or more precisely, a very confusing reading of the Beis Yosef in Rabbeinu Yerucham. So Rabbeinu Yerucham, A, holds that it's unresolved what they are, and B, the Beis Yosef says, therefore he holds it's also to learn from them whichever one they are. And we know why the Beis Yosef read this in Rabbeinu Yerucham. Because let's look back in Rabbeinu Yerucham. Rabbeinu Yerucham cites the Gemara of Halomid ben Amgushi afilu tevito chayv misa. Here he says chayv misa because he's quoting the Gemara, and then he says Amgushi hu mechashev oy min ha'oduk b'avodah zarah. He's either a magician or a heretic. Now, that's not really an accurate quote of the Gemara, because if you have the possibility, if you consider that there remains the possibility that an Amgushi is a magician, not a heretic, then you can't say that someone who learns from an Amgushi is chayiv misa, because Rav holds that if you learn from a magician, you're not chayiv misa. You're allowed to learn from magicians. You just can't do magic, but you're allowed to learn from them. So how is Rabbeinu Yerucham reading the Gemara? Unless Rabbeinu Yerucham somehow learned that this is part of the suffix of the Gemara, and that Shmuel disagrees with the idea that you're allowed to learn from magicians. But where is there a hint in the Gemara of that case? It's true that Rav is the one who says you're allowed to learn from magicians, but the debate between Rav and Shmuel is simply over what are Amgushta. Are they magicians? Are they heretics? There's no indication that Shmuel would disagree with Rav's allowance to learn magic from magicians as long as you don't practice it. Where do we see that that Shmuel would disagree with this? So this is a terrible puzzle in Rabbeinu Yerucham.
So can I ask a question? I'm struggling a bit. On if the Gemara concludes to stayim at the end, surely the simple reading, as we said before, was we're leaning on the fact that we're following Rav, who's synonymous with the world of the Avodah Zarah view, and therefore how can the Beit Yosef or Beit Yerucham come down? If we're leaning to that, is this the problem, that how can you come down and come up with, you suddenly throw in the Machashef alongside being Osa? Because if the simple reading of the Gemara is it's really talking about Avodah Zarah, Gedufi, then how can you start throwing in Machashef? Is that essentially the problem?
No, it's a point, but that's not what I'm asking on Rabbeinu Yerucham. Again, let me just try and make this clearer. The Gemara says Tistayim. I think, but I'm wrong because Rashi says not like me, that the simplest reading of Tistayim is we resolve our dilemma, and it is Rav who made the original. Rav who holds that Amgushta are heretics, and it is Shmuel who holds they're magicians. Rashi says not like that, and Rashi says that the conclusion of the Gemara is Tistayim, that you're not allowed to learn from heretics, from these Amgushta, because they are heretics. Either way, whether the halacha in the Gemara is resolved, as per Rashi, that you're not allowed to learn from Amgushta because they're heretics, or whether the Gemara simply resolved the fact that Rav said position A and Shmuel said position B, either way, the reason you're not allowed to learn from Amgushta, according to Rav, is because of the possibility that they're heretics, because Rav holds they're heretics. But were we to know that they were magicians, even Rav would agree you could learn from them, because Rav says explicitly you can learn from magicians. So let's say somehow Rav became convinced that Amgushta were magicians, then he would back off his statement and he would say you can learn from Amgushta that are magicians, because Rav holds you can learn from magicians. However, Rav holds the heretics, and therefore he says you can't learn from heretics. Do we have any evidence from the Gemara that there is an opinion in the Gemara that says you can't learn from magicians? That Amgushta are magicians and you can't learn from them. The only figure we know who says you can't learn from Amgushta is Rav, and that's because Rav holds they're heretics. That's what the Gemara explains. And Rav himself says explicitly you can learn from magicians. Shmuel holds that Amgushta are magicians. Do we have any evidence that Shmuel would nonetheless say you're not allowed to learn from Amgushta? Do we have a statement of Shmuel that says you're not allowed to learn from magicians?
Yes, because it says you're not allowed to learn la'asot. You can't learn to do magic, but Rav seems to hold in the words of the Gemara that you can learn in a limited manner from a magician. You can learn what the parameters of magic are, so you understand what's osa. Whereas you can't associate with heretics at all, because any kind of learning from heretics, even of Divrei Torah, is dangerous.
Correct. So again, I repeat my question. Do we have any opinion in the Gemara who says that if Amgushta are magicians, you can't learn from magicians?
Yeah, because
I just wondered if I may say.
Well, because it's the aval atala made lahavin that you're only allowed to learn in a limited way from magicians. What you can only learn so as to understand what they're doing, so you can understand the boundary of what's also. But I think that's in the Gemara, isn't it?
The Gemara doesn't, it's not clear exactly how to read the Gemara and the precise delineation of what you can and can't learn. But the core idea, which is you're allowed to learn from the magicians, is explicit in Rav. And do we find any opinion, evidence that anyone argues on that allowance of Rav to do? Yes, Paul.
No, I'm just thinking that you were saying we don't really know Shmuel's, the full view of Shmuel. And Rashi has got here the Amrian Bechol Duchter Ravu Shmuel Pligabe. So as if there are other references that we haven't seen, that maybe there is somewhere else where we will find out a bit more about Shmuel's view.
So which Rashi are you citing?
Dibra Matkala Amagusha.
No, Amgusha Domina B'chol Duchter. This phrase Amgusha, Rav and Shmuel argue what Amgusha are. So that's a machlokas over what they are.
Oh, they are what they are, not in every. But he says in every B'chol Duchter, in every place.
No, the comma goes elsewhere. It's Amgusha Domina B'chol Duchter. These Amgusha will be referenced in every place. Rav and Shmuel Peligibe. Rav and Shmuel argue over what they are. So there's a machlokas over what Amgusha are.
In every location.
Amgusha is mentioned many times in Shas. And Rav and Shmuel argue this general rule over what Amgusha are.
Yeah, no, I'm with that, but I'm just saying that as Amgusha is mentioned in many places, are there other places that we can see? Can we identify? My shine
isn't about Amgusha. My question is about magicians. Do we find in our sugya? Do we see that an opinion who holds that you cannot learn from magicians as being the view of Shmuel? In our sugya, all we have is the view of Rav, who says you can learn from magicians, as Edward points out in a limited way, yes. You can learn theoretical magic, you just can't practice it or learn to practice it. And we don't find anyone who argues with that. So where does this statement, Rabbeinu Yerucham cites our Gemara in Shabbos Ein Hey Amud Aleph. And he says Rav and Shmuel argue over how to define Amgushta, and therefore, whether they are magicians or heretics, don't learn from them. That's not correct. If they're heretics, you can't learn from them. If they're magicians, you can learn from them to some degree.
Is it not that we have an anonymous statement that you can't learn from Magushta? Whatever you hold, whatever you know about Magushta, you can't learn from them. And then we have a second machloket, who are Magushta. So both Rav and Shmuel are relying on an earlier source that you cannot rely on Magushta. And it doesn't matter almost what the reason is. They've just got that as Halacha l'Moshe Misinai, as it were. And then they have a machloket among themselves as to which it is. And therefore, by definition, Shmuel has to hold that you can't. If he holds the opposite of Rav, that's what he has to hold.
The problem is there isn't an anonymous earlier source. We know who the earlier source is, which is, let's not forget, this is all part of the statements made by Rav Zutra bar Tuvia Omar Rav. Look at the second line of the Gemara. Omar Rav Zutra bar Tuvia Omar Rav, Hameteach chut shel tefillah b'Shabbat chayv chatos. Rule number one, which we've spent time on, tightening a thread. Lo midava echel min amalko shchayv misa. Statement number two. Statement number three, which we'll get up to one day, is lo midava echel min. Sorry, statement number three is lo midava yudei lachshon to kufas mazonos ve'enu choshev asa, etc. So it's Rav who says that you can't learn from Amgushi, and we now know why Rav said it, because Rav was of the opinion that they're heretics. Had Rav thought they were magicians, he would have said you can learn from them to some degree, because Rav holds you can learn from magicians.
But could it be sometimes when people are stated, they're saying their own tradition, sometimes they are just quoting a tradition. And so in this case, Rav is quoting a known tradition that you can't learn from Magushta, which everyone accepts. It just so happens we later go on to explain that what Rav means by an Amgushta is one thing. Shmuel, who also holds by this earlier tradition that you can, would hold that an Amgushta is something else.
Okay, so I would agree with you partially, in which evidently this is how Rabbi Yerucham is reading the Gemara, that even Shmuel would agree you can't learn from the Magush, even though he holds that Magush are magicians, and therefore he would hold you can't learn from magicians. But my question is, why on earth is he reading the Gemara like that? In the Prince, again, I understand we engage quite intensely here in trying to cheshbon out the Gemara. There's an important point of logic over here. One thing we know for sure, that Rav and Shmuel argue over what Magush is. Are they magicians or are they heretics? That's explicit. It's possible that Shmuel holds anything else about the world also, but why create a machlokus when we have no evidence for it? In the Gemara generally has a principle of being parsimonious, being miserly about what we know. Anything that we don't have evidence for, we'll assume we don't know it. So if you say that Shmuel holds you can't learn from Amgushta, even though they are magicians, we now have two arguments. A factual argument in Metzias over what Amgushta are they magicians or heretics, and a halachic argument about are you allowed to learn from magicians or not? And there's no evidence for that. All we have evidence for is a factual argument over whether you can learn from Amgushta, what Amgushta are. And Rav says, who holds the heretics, that you can't learn from them. That's very reasonable, because we know you can't learn from heretics. Where do we have evidence that Shmuel disagrees and holds that you can't learn from magicians? So what you're saying is sort of mathematically correct, that it would appear that Rabbi Yerucham learns that Shmuel argues and holds you can't learn from magicians, but I don't know where he gets that from. Sorry, Max.
Well, no, as you said, the Gemara explicitly says, I think it's the Gemara saying it, Los Lamed La Sos. So it would seem to be that's unanimous opinion. Or is not?
No, I don't think that's correct. Let me just look at my Gemara again.
No, I'm saying what you're saying, that everyone would hold that there's no one who says you can't learn from a magician in order to understand them.
Correct.
Yeah,
correct.
Because Gemara itself.
Where do we get from that Shmuel disagrees with this? Absolutely.
I'm saying yes.
Yeah, no, I'm agreeing with you. Yeah. Sorry, I wasn't agreeing with you, but now that I've understood what you're saying, I'm agreeing with you.
Okay.
And thank you for coming to my my defense. You're absolutely right. I should have argued my question more strongly, and I didn't. You're absolutely right. Yeah, I'm just re-looking at the Gemara. I could have made my point more clearly. Yeah. Okay, so we'll stop there because we've run out of time. I would ask you again, I'm sorry this has got very technical, but I don't see a way of avoiding this. We're going to have to plow our way through the Beis Yosef, the Bach, the Shulchan Aruch, and the Shach and the Gon, and try and work out how they're reading the Gemara. So on that note, I wish you all a good day, and we'll revisit this Tuesday, hopefully, and get a little clearer.
Shkoyach, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.